Andrew, we're so grateful for your support. Welcome back to Constitutional Chats.
It is so great to be here with all of you, and this is a subject matter that is near and dear to my heart. Having worked on regulatory issues for the majority of my career, um, it's one of those things where I really try to get folks impassioned about it. What are we talking about here? And I especially love the framing of the topic about the balance between individual rights and government power, because invariably, whether or not it's in this context or the context of the classroom, one of the things I always start with is the idea that government doesn't have rights, government has powers, people have rights, and that we cede some measure of those rights to the government in the form of those powers. Every time government grows, individual rights are diminished. You cannot reconcile liberty with anti-liberty, right? It's axiomatic. So what we're talking about here with the issue of regulation is what happens when Congress passes a law and how that law gets interpreted and enforced. We know that under Article 1 of the Constitution, Congress has the power to make law. But Congress invariably doesn't define every term in a statute that they pass. They leave that to the executive branch to interpret. And those interpretations are what we call regulations. And at the end of the day, as I'm fond of saying, when the rubber hits the wall, or more to the point, this is where the rubber hits the road, these rules and regulations. And it's funny because as we were talking, as Jewel was introducing Angie, and the work that she's going to be doing on wind and solar projects, the property rights issues, the example that I tend to use is another property rights one. And it underscores it very simply, which is, Congress passed, for instance, in 1972, the Clean Water Act. And the Clean Water Act says you cannot pollute a navigable water of the United States. But Congress didn't define the terms navigable or water of the United States in statute. They left that to the agencies. In this case, it's the Army Corps of Engineers and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to define those terms and other terms. And the process by which they go about doing it is the regulatory process. And at the end of the day, what we have are regulations. And so it's up to, and we're going to get into in a second, just how this all works in practice. But at the end of the day, that's what it is. It's when we talk about regulations, when we talk about rules, we use those terms interchangeably. And what's wonderful about this is that there's a whole process that governs this. And yes, you as an average American citizen can help to inform the legislative process, but there are laws on the books that really speak to the role that individuals can play in crafting these regulations. And it really it's a democratizing of the process, right? Again, as we're constantly talking about in the federalist structure that we have, the balance of power and the checks and balances that happen, right? We know that we have a representational or representative republic, especially when it comes to our legislature, right? Our legislators are not experts on everything. They can't hear from 100% of their constituents 100% of the time. But the process by which those statutes are turned into regulations, we do allow for the American public to be heard in a very real and meaningful way. And what do I mean by that? I mean that in the late 1940s, agencies, what do I mean by agencies? So the various departments of the federal government. So you have the White House, and then under that you have all of the cabinets, and you have all kinds of other agencies that may not be cabinet level, like the Department of Commerce's cabinet level, the Department of Transportation, the Department of the Treasury. The SBA may now be cabinet level. The EPA, I think, is now cabinet level, but all kinds of different agencies that are there. The Congress, says in statute which agencies are responsible for the enforcement of these laws. And these agencies are then turning around and they're putting out proposals for the people to comment on. So for many, many years, as the bureaucracy grew, the process by which the public was involved in the commenting was very slipshod. It was very disorganized. Different agencies had different procedures for doing things. And so in the late 1940s, someone said, this is a bad way of doing it. It's unfair to the public. You know, if you want to comment on something and you're unfamiliar with the particular procedures of the Department of Commerce because you're used to commenting on things at the Department of Treasury, it's unfair. It's unfair to the public, and we need to be increasing public participation. So in the late 1940s, Congress passed a law called the Administrative Procedure Act, the APA. And the APA governs this process. And what the APA says is that the agencies are required, if they're going to, when they take with the exception of very rare circumstances, when an agency is going to take a piece of statute and it's going to create regulations, new rules out of that statute, that there are specific procedures that have to be undertaken and the public has to be involved. And depending on the breadth of the regulatory change or new interpretation or whatever, depending on how expensive it is, cost of the economy, and we'll get to that in a moment, that determines how many different stages that are involved in the public commenting on them. The agency has to go out and put what's called a notice of proposed rulemaking, or an NPRM, into a daily publication called the Federal Register. Right, the Federal Register is a catalog every day, every weekday, of actions that the federal government is starting to undertake or is undertaking, and this is their announcement of it. And so the agency has to put an announcement in the Federal Register, and then they have to give the public the opportunity to file comments on them. They have to give them a date certain. And then, most importantly, if you file substantive comments, if somebody files substantive comments in the rule, those substantive comments have to be addressed. And the agency has to say in the final notice or the final rule why they either addressed your comments or why they didn't address your comments. And they have to account for how expensive they think the rule is going to be. There are a whole bunch of things they have to do through this process. And what it does is it affords the average everyday American the opportunity to say something about what is a navigable water of the United States. And I'll give an example, and these have the impact of being able to change rules. So many, many years ago, probably, let's say 20 plus years ago, the EPA the Environmental Protection Agency was considering a rule regarding the emissions, what comes the particulates that come out of the tailpipe of an off-road diesel engine, a tractor engine. And they were going to mandate that every tractor have this be retrofitted with this box that would be put on top of the engine to capture these emissions. And they were moving headlong into this, and all was going well until some small farmer said, you know something, I go out and I look at my tractor, and I can't fit this thing on there, and I can't close the top of my tractor if you mandate that I put this on here, the hood of my tractor. And that stymied the rule. That's the kind of impact that these things have. And then if you want to challenge a final rule down the road, the only way you have what's called standing, and we can get into this if you want, standing to challenge the rule is by filing comments in the process. Right. Otherwise, you will have been presumed to have done it too late. You can't raise it after the fact. You have to get involved early on. And I know that frustrates a lot of people. And so I spend a lot of time in my day job trying to increase public participation in these kinds of rulemakings. There's an office at the SBA, the Small Business Administration, called the Office of Advocacy. They're very good about soliciting from the small business community about this. Real quick, because I know we're running short on my introductory time, and I want to have plenty of time for questions. Regulations have a cost, and we can get into issues there and how you measure them, but that's the whole point of regulation, especially regulations that have to do with the environment or public health and safety. Because what you are trying to do is mitigate or change behavior that poses some kind of risk to public health. And what you're trying to do is raise the cost of doing the wrong thing. Right? You don't want people to ignore the law. So you have them go through these procedures, and those procedures are generally going to cost money somewhere. We could get into trade-offs and the broken windows theory, but the bottom line here is that we have to be better at assessing the costs and benefits of regulation and assessing what are real problems. Right now, just by way of introduction, regulations now cost the economy about $4 trillion annually. That's up from about $2.25 trillion at the end of 2020, early 2021, a substantial increase in the last 4 years. We can get into a little bit more about that and the impact there. But let me leave it there and sort of open it up. That's the general overview constitutionally and the process itself. But look forward to questions. Am I still on?
Yeah, you're on, Andrew.
Yes.
I'm not sure if maybe Jewel might be frozen up a little bit.
Okay.
I certainly have a question for you.
Please.
Why is it okay if I cut the line a little bit?
You know what? Yeah, let's just go for it. Yeah, if you want to take
Please.
the
Okay.
first round of questions, yeah, that's up to you. So,
Um,
without further ado,
I love everything you said and explained, Andrew. It it so hits home because we're farmers, you
Yeah.
know. And my husband and I often joke about regulation. Like, I just want a truck and I just want to cut the muffler off, you know? And what kind of EPA rule am I gonna have? Or I want to delete the diesel? Am I gonna be, in violation of law? And then there's also a couple like kind of entertaining but fascinating books like Everything I Want to Do is Illegal.
Right.
And it goes upon the storyline of someone basically having a family farm, and as they're trying to open up their own business and expand, just things they run into. And I guess my question is, what are some good ways that you guys are going about it with the SBA or something else in terms of the press to get people really in this process? Like
Right.
one thing I think of is it might have been a Musk idea, Elon Musk idea, I'm not sure, where you sort of have these regulatory ideas, and then you can upvote them or downvote them or comment, almost like a social media platform for them. Um, are there things like that that are coming into the future or more press ways that you're thinking about getting the public involved?
Right. So the one of the problems is we don't want the regulatory process to turn into some kind of a referendum or plebiscite. Now, understanding the a number of people who vote who put comments into a regular what's called a regulatory docket, which is literally the file cabinet. Picture a virtual file cabinet. That's a docket. The numbers of people and on which sides of an issue are important, and they're important for telling a story, engaging public interest. But what we're really looking for is the substantive side of things, right? That's the real part of the issue. And in that case, depending on how you do it. So one of the things is there are some other laws that are on the books. One is called the Regulatory Flexibility Act, which is a law that says that the agencies have to offer up alternatives and alternative possibilities to make things more flexible. And then there's something called the Small Business Regulatory Enforcement Fairness Act, where the agencies are supposed to specifically account for how regulations and regulatory costs impact small businesses, small family farms, even small government entities, because a lot of these government entities are responsible for implementing the law here. I apologize, guys, for my dogs in the background. So, we have to be really cautious about this. And I say this because the side that is calling for greater amounts of regulation has always been better at getting identical, we used to call them postcard comments. And now, again, it's the virtual equivalent of postcard comments, identical comments into a docket as a way of trying to say, well, 100,000 people want to prevent logging to protect the spotted owl, right? Which is
Mm,
something that really
mhm,
happened. Um,
mhm.
Whereas only 50 people put in the pro free market side of it. And so clearly 100,000 outweighs the 50, but it doesn't get into the real world substantive impacts of these things. So I'm sorry. So, but to answer your question, so
That
some of
makes
it is
sense.
the SBA's Office of Advocacy is the only entity within the federal government that can challenge the proposals of other agencies without having to go through and get permission from the Office of Management and Budget. And That's important. I don't think we need to get into the specifics of this. So they are very good at reaching out to the small business community. The Center for Regulatory Freedom, is doing better at both coordinating among the other small policy organizations, but in particularly important regulatory issues, we are out there with our large CPAC activist list, letting them get involved. I'll give you an example real quick. So a couple of years ago, the Biden administration was trying to shut down offshore drilling or make it impossible for independent oil producers to drill offshore. And we got our grassroots involved and got several thousand comments in on that. So there are ways to do it. I mean, obviously, getting out in the press, we think there needs to be better accounting. Um, I'm not so sure if the up or down vote is, I'm not so sure that that wouldn't backfire, but that's just me.
Well, I mean, I think that's a beautiful and honest response, because I know, well, myself and even some other people on the call, I've thought, hey, what a great idea, but it's good to hear the context of what that could do.
Right.
It could equal somebody's complaint or comment being repeated
Angie,
rather.
let me give you a really good example of this.
Mhm.
So about 10, 11 years ago, the IRS was going after the right that people have to participate in politics anonymously, especially by supporting organizations that who can keep their donor lists private, right? The IRS needs to know, and even then we can debate that. But the bottom line is the public doesn't need to know who is giving to various nonprofits. It's an element of the First Amendment. So there were 100 and let's say at least 100,000 comments that were filed on this. Um, and that was the most that the IRS had ever gotten in the previous 7 years combined. It was some insane amount of comments. Now that was good. It told an important story of the public's interest in this, but really the most important comments came from the NAACP. On who the most seminal Supreme Court case on this is named after them, or at least up until that point, the most seminal Supreme Court case was named for them, NAACP versus Alabama. And so it's important to have those substantive comments in the docket, less of an issue on the numbers. So again, the numbers tell a very important story in terms of signaling that maybe Congress ought to get involved.
Okay.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you, Andrew.
You're welcome.
I'm going to let somebody else pop in if they've got another question.
Yes, my internet for whatever reason fell off, but I got
No
the
worries.
back up, so we're back on. Back, take back and just talk about the constitutionality of regulations as a whole. So you spoke about that government does not have right; it has powers.
Right.
And I think that it's an important framing for this discussion. So taking I know that every regulation is not going to draw its validity from the same part of the Constitution. But so that being said, can you tell me about where the federal government gets its power to have these regulations in a broad sense?
Right. So it stems from the interrelationship between Article 1 and Article 2. So Article 1 gives Congress the power to legislate and make laws respecting a whole host of areas, right? Now those are enumerated in the Constitution, what they're allowed to do. A lot of this stuff comes under the power, Congress's power to regulate commerce between the states. And we can get into the issues of how that's been reinterpreted over time. But what happens is that the Constitution then in Article 2 gives the power to the executive branch to take those laws and interpret and enforce those laws. So they are all grounded in the Constitution, except for when the executive branch exceeds the authority under the Constitution, right? So, or exceeds the authority that Congress gave it to act. So this gets into things like the major questions doctrine, which I can get to in a moment, or deference. How much deference are you supposed to give these agencies, which was decided in a big Supreme Court case last year. And so that gets to the breadth of power by which these agencies have to interpret statute. There's a whole nother issue of deference having to do with their ability to reinterpret their own regulations. We can set that aside for a minute, but let me talk about the issue of deference. So in the 1980s, there was a case decided by the Supreme Court called Chevron versus NRDC. And in that Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court said, we are not going to, and we do not think that Congress ever meant to substitute its general judgment as legislators for that of the experts in these agencies. And so we are going to give these agencies the presumption that they are the experts in a particular subject matter. So the people at the EPA are subject matter experts in environmental protection. The folks at the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, they're experts in occupational safety and health, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, unless you can demonstrate that their interpretation is completely at odds, and I'm going to give you a farming example in a second, completely at odds with what Congress said in statute, we're going to give them deference. And it created this very absurd situation in which the modern regulatory state can massively grow and essentially quadruple in size in the last 15 years, maybe even a little more. And so, it hugely impactful in that regard. And I'll give you an example. So, for instance, um, talking about this issue of the waters of the United States, and I say this because we're going back through another round of this. One of the things the Clean Water Act says is the EPA cannot regulate normal farming activity, right? That if you are a farmer and you create furrows in your farm, like normal farm furrows in your field, that's not subject to regulation under the Clean Water Act. But runoff from mountains is. And in about 2015, somebody at the EPA had the brilliant idea to say, you know something? We're going to consider these furrows on these farm fields to be mini mountain ranges, and that therefore the runoff from these mini mountain ranges, and for those of you listening, I'm doing air quotes, that is subject to regulation by the Clean Water Act. And when this test balloon was put out there, a lot of folks said, no, 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 no. And just so you understand, you're going to lose on a Chevron argument here. And so they withdrew it. Another issue was the so-called Clean Power Initiative under President Obama, in which the EPA was going to essentially get rid of, under the Clean Air Act, coal power generation. But because they were essentially forcing through some very specific language in the Clean Air Act, the entire remaking of America's energy economy, West Virginia challenged this. And at the time, the Supreme Court said, no, this violates what we call our major questions doctrine. You can't take very small pieces of language in statute and run a regulatory truck through them. And then the next case this past year was something called Loper Bright and Relentless. They were two cases. And this challenged the concept of the Chevron doctrine. And I can get into the specifics if you want. The bottom line here is now the agencies, the shoe is on the foot of the agencies to justify their regulatory changes with very specific language and statute. And I got to tell you, for folks who are skeptical of any administration, let alone this one, but if you're skeptical of executive branch power because your political enemy is in the cat seat and wielding it, then you should be applauding the Supreme Court in Loper Bright overturning Chevron, because it constrains your enemies just as much as it constrains your friends. And we can get into the reaction to that if you want, but that's it in a nutshell.
And then this is a super basic question. So you can I forgot to ask something I should have, which is can you just tell us quickly what a regulation is? What are we talking about when we say regulations?
A regulation is the interpretation of statute by a particular agency. It's a rule that is created as the interpretation of statutory language.
And then can you tell me some examples how in our everyday life, my everyday life, what are some regulations from the federal government that I may interact with that may affect me?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Right. If you have at least up until fairly recently, because they're now dismantling them. If you had if you bought a dishwasher in the last few years, your dishwasher was subject to the regulations under the Clean Water Act of so-called super efficiency, which actually usually meant that you would have to wash your dishes several times. Same thing with the so-called low flow toilet rule. The fact that you can't buy a lot of large trucks that are out there. The station wagon, for those of you who are older and you remember this sort of thing that we had before minivans called a station wagon. Well, we don't have station wagons really, very many of them anymore, because of something called corporate average fuel economy standards. By the same token, let me think of some of the other ones that we have. Um, oh, good Lord. Um, yeah, of course, so many of them come to mind. Um,
Yeah,
but
I
of
think
course, they
that, I
sort of
mean,
all go on.
those,
Yeah,
yeah, those right off the bat, though, I mean,
yeah,
I think that makes it more real for me, for all of our
right.
listeners to really realize that that's coming from the federal government. And now
Yeah.
me as a, I am very skeptical of federal powers,
Sure.
always. And so I also believe in many of our founders' view about what power will do. That eventually, that man's ambition will make people drive to exert the most amount of power they can over a period of time. That you will have, if you have a government, that government's going to attempt to increase its power. But let's set that aside for now, um, and that effect within our agencies, and say pretend that our agencies really love every American person. They really care about these things, and they are totally benign, so they have the best intentions.
This is
Even that
great.
being said, yeah, even that being said, part of what my concern is, and part of why I have an inherent allergy to regulation, is that no matter what, the federal government in some way is advantaging some parties over another. So we have this free market system, and in some ways, the federal government then is tipping its finger on the scale and choosing winners and losers.
Right. Let me sort of get offer up two companion aphorisms. I used to say, I still say it, that the most well-intentioned policies eventually bump up against very real realities. Right. So you, again, assuming for a moment that it's all benign and it's not meant to harm people and it's not meant to change these things, eventually it bumps up against very real realities. So, for instance, again, to use another environmental example, um, uh, diesel in cars, the EPA mandated that you had to have if you have a diesel engine that you're offering up for sale, then the diesel engine has to have a specific amount of power, it has to have a specific amount of fuel economy, and it has to have a specific amount of non-polluting status to it. The problem is you can't do all three at once, right? Physically, it's impossible. Physiochemistry, it's impossible. And so VW claimed that they had done it. And guess what? Turns out they hadn't. They actually lied about it, and it was a whole big thing. My dad simplified it for me. He heard me say it on the radio one day, and he calls me up afterwards and he says, Andrew, what you're saying is too complicated. There are many roads to utopia. However, all must traverse the surface of the earth. Right? So that's where we're going with this. And so, the reality always intrudes here. Now, the other part of this is, as you rightly point out, the more complicated the system, the more it can be ginned to winners and losers. And when I was doing small business lobbying, anytime I saw big government, big labor, and big business get together, not that I have a problem with big business, but anytime I saw the three of them getting together, I knew that they were coming after small businesses, because small businesses, the regulatory impacts are more expensive, 50% more expensive for businesses with fewer than 20 employees. And they can use regulation because they can afford to bring on higher levels of rules. I'll give you an example in a second. And so they can use this as a tool to drive small businesses out of business. That's a problem. For instance, if you're a multinational corporation and you are already subjecting yourself to European levels of regulation, well, you want to get those rules adopted here in the United States, or those levels adopted here in the United States, for what's called global harmonization. Again, air quotes. Because you know that small businesses are not going to be able to comply. It'll drive your small competitors out, and that's a problem.
And I do think that our American system has benefited so greatly in the freedom of our market is part of what incentivizes just the innovation, the
100%.
higher standard of living, dreaming, and also the ability to exercise the virtues and this belief of, our God-given rights, our God-given talents, and using those things without necessarily needing permission. But the more and more you look at it, it's like, wow, there's a whole lot of permissions I need these days. So we may be able to circle back to some of that, but I want to get to Wyatt's questions here. So if you're ready, Wyatt, you can go ahead and ask the great Andrew Langer your questions.
Mhm. Yeah, so this is Wyatt Hensley here. Thank you so much for being on. Definitely a very important subject that I feel like a lot of people aren't, there's definitely some good regulations, I would argue. I mean, that protect some, or I should say well-intentioned
Right.
regulations. But I really liked how you pointed out too because I was going to ask about this, the small versus large businesses. Because I
Right.
mean, small businesses are the backbone of our economy. And when you have all of these regulations, that are hindering the small businesses, that's a huge issue.
Right.
So
Right.
yeah.
And so let me particularize it for you as we talk about this. So we know, and you never do math on the air. I'm going to do a little bit of math here. We
Mhm.
know that as President Biden was taking office, oh, good Lord, no, I'm going to butcher it. Um, the point is that uh, right, the cost of regulation went from about $7,700 per employee per year to over $14,000 per employee per year. It's probably up there. Let's just say right now that it's like $15,000 per employee per year. That means that if you have a business with 10 employees, that's $150,000 a year that you're spending in regulatory costs. And that's just in direct regulatory costs. The things you need to do, the equipment you need to buy as a small business owner, et cetera. That's money you cannot plow back into the business. You can't hire more employees. You can't get equipment, right? So that's what we call the broken windows theory of this. The folks who say, well, regulations produce economic benefits because there are whole industries that get created out of this. Well, that's not the way it works, right? That's what we call the broken windows theory, which is to say, if you are as someone who repairs windows for a living and business is slow, you could theoretically pay somebody to run through a strip mall with rocks and break all the windows, and you have created economic activity for yourself because folks are going to come to you to repair your windows. But on the other hand, the money that these folks are going to have to spend to repair their windows or an increased insurance, that's money that goes out the door to them. That's the sort of the general argument here for this. And that's just in, as I said, direct regulatory costs. We know that for every dollar in direct regulatory costs, there's about a $19 multiplier in lost opportunity cost. And to get to your point, Wyatt, your initial point, the reason why we have the modern regulatory state is because there have been problems in the past when we didn't care about the various problems. So, for instance, we had rivers catching on fire in America in up until the 1970s. The Cuyahoga River in Ohio caught on fire. So we passed the Clean Water Act, a very important piece of legislation because we don't want to pollute navigable waters of the United States. But it doesn't come without a cost. Why do we have a rust belt in America? Well, when you increase the regulatory costs vis-a-vis our competitors abroad, we're going to lose jobs here at home. So we have to find ways to find common ground, answer the question of things. How clean is clean? At what level? What is it? And not that I want to get into issues like what is a human life work or human health worth, but we also know, that there are certain things we can go. We know that in America or anywhere, there is nothing that we can do that doesn't come with some element of risk. You cannot eliminate risk. And so we as a society need to be able to determine what sort of risks we want to take in our lives, what those costs are, and how we balance these things out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really enjoy you talking about some of the history of
Thanks.
these regulations too. I did not know that rivers were literally catching on
Oh,
fire.
literally
That
catching on
kind of
fire. Oh, yeah.
No, that's absolutely crazy. But I was also along some of those lines. What are some of the other social movements that have advocated for and helped increase regulations too?
Well, I mean, listen, all of them. I mean, anybody who's calling for new laws, um, they're out there. They're I mean, again, you can get into the traditional statist, right? Those who wish to grow the size of the state versus the anti-statists, right? Those who wish to sort of increase and maximize individual liberty. But anytime you're looking at for Congress to pass a law or change a law or to get an agency to increase their power. And I think it was Jewel who said this, being skeptical of this, right? Because these rules can be used. The whole goal is to change human behavior, either overtly or covertly. That's what we're talking about here. So, for instance, if you have a rule that is going to say that everybody has to submit how many miles a year they travel in their car, and then they get taxed on those vehicles traveled. It both discourages people from driving. It's gin to try to get more people on mass transit. Now, my dogs are arguing again. Get people in mass transit, moving closer to cities, and therefore their behavior can be controlled, right? If you're out of your car and you're onto somebody else's schedule, that you give up a certain element of your individual liberty here. So that's, for me, I always ask myself, is what we're doing serving to empower people, or is it serving to disempower people?
Yeah, and I mean, with your example too of the with what you were just talking about having to record miles, if that, I'm not saying it actually happens, but if that were to happen, not to think too of some of the disadvantages for people who live in rural areas where public transportation there is none.
100%.
And so that's some of those in or unforeseen circumstances that not all lawmakers think about when,
Absolutely. And folks, if you can hear my dogs, it's because the Amazon guy showed up, and it's nightmarish.
It's really limited, Andrew. We can't hear it much,
Good.
so
Oh, well, that's
don't worry.
excellent. It's just me that gets completely distracted by this. But that's exactly it. Again, getting down to these issues of intent, it can be and is every time government has the power to pick winners and losers. It has the power to make decisions for people out of their hands, and has the power to be corrupted, right? Anytime you've seen any example of corruption in our government, federal, state, local, whatever, it's because government has the power to pick winners and losers, or transfuse large sums of cash out of the public treasury into somebody's pockets.
yeah, wow.
And so by the way, the end result is the only answer if you want to solve government corruption is to sharply limit government's ability to do those things.
Yeah, and that kind of goes along with my next question too, limiting some of, because you're talking about these bureaucracies. Congress passes the law,
Right.
but they're often very vague, so it leaves the agencies immense amount of power to interpret and try to enforce these laws. So what could Congress do or the people do to help limit some of these agencies' powers and over-regulating?
And so some of this now has become particularly important in light of the Supreme Court decision last year overturning Chevron and severely limiting the agency's power to, interpret vague statutes. But I got into this discussion with a member of Congress, I would say probably 20 years ago, who wanted me to beat up on the agencies for expansive power. And I said, well, Congressman, frankly, it starts with you, because, if members of Congress don't want to take a stand in terms of how laws get, the legislation, the statutes that they pass, then that gives the agencies cause. And let me give you a really interesting example of congressional cowardice, because the Supreme Court, overturned Chevron last year. And immediately a handful of members of Congress there, so they were aghast. How dare, the Supreme Court tell us that we need to do our jobs? We're going to pass something called the Stop Corporate Capture Act, and give this power back to the agencies. Now, of course, they're unhappy about who's in power now, so they don't want to give that power back. And to me, that's always the issue, right? And the tension here. And the question you need to ask leaders is, if you are aghast at the amount of power that the executive branch has, what are you doing to take that back? Or are you only wanting to take it back when the people you don't like are in the executive branch? If that's the case, then there's something fundamentally wrong here. We want legislators who understand that this is their job. And to that end, by the way, I am going to throw a name out there. Congresswoman Harriet Hageman from Wyoming. She is engaging in a task force right now on this very issue. A good colleague of mine, Wayne Cruz, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, who is the man behind the concept of regulatory dark matter. Wayne testified before this committee a couple of weeks ago. That's good. And then, the agencies just have to be better about doing this, and we have to be better as a public in making sure that the agencies remain constrained within the confines of the law.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why also to your message about the advocacy office, that's
Yep.
so important that the members of the public are being made aware of some of these regulations and some of the effects that how it will impact us in our daily lives.
Right.
So yeah, well, thank you for a great discussion, and I will hand it right back on to Jewel.
There we go.
Okay, we've got some awesome audience questions. So
Great.
we'll start off, just go right through them. Would you please comment on the theory of regulatory capture that political scientists have discussed? Asked by
Right.
Bay Morrison.
And that is of course the issue of industries and businesses. Sort of they are dependent upon this, and they're dependent on perpetuating this system. Now we all want certainty, right? If we're a business owner, or really we're anybody, we want some kind of certainty in the rules here. But what we don't want is for the system to take on a life of its own, and for those who benefit from the system to be able to advocate for ever increasing amounts or the maintenance of regulations that are onerous to everybody else. The other part of this is the idea that the agencies and the agency personnel become constituencies unto themselves. Matt Jensen at the America First Policy Institute is really doing really interesting work about the fiscal impacts of regulation, right? If the regulatory state has grown so large and the bureaucracy has grown so large and powerful that they can affect whole elections, that's an issue because it becomes very difficult to turn around and dismantle the regulatory state or bringing some kind of a rationality to this. Let me add, because what's very important here, yes, when we have a regulatory state that now costs $4 trillion, it would be wonderful and it will be wonderful to reduce some of those rules, but you cannot overstate the importance of just keeping things on what I call the regulatory glide path. If things had continued on the trajectory they were going on for the last 4 years, growing the cost of regulation by 15% a year, we would be at $7 trillion in direct regulatory costs by 2030. But if we can save that $3 trillion annually, which translates into $57 trillion in regained opportunity cost, that has tremendous impacts for the economy. And I dare say it's part of the reason why, in light of everything else going on with the economy and uncertainty, we actually added a huge number of jobs, the issue of deregulation.
And then James Takeda asks, can resolutions formed in our caucus used to develop state party platforms be considered
Wait, I missed the tail
better?
end of that. Say that again?
Um, he asked, can resolutions formed in our caucus be used to develop state party platforms be considered for input? I'm not
Well,
sure.
sure. No. And I get that. But here's the thing. It has to be done within the context of the rulemaking period, right? So anybody can file comments and use anything to file those comments. And let me get into this for a second real quick, because this is so vitally important. When I was teaching on this, and I deal mostly with federal regulations. So there's an amazing platform called regulations.gov. So it's just that simple. And every day there are new regulations and regulatory proposals that are out there. When I was teaching, I would have my students go and look at regulations that had come open for comment in the previous 7 days and regulations that were coming close for comment in the coming week. And they had to pick one and they had to explain it. Not that, you need to go every day and be looking at regulations.gov. I need to be better at informing the public about this. But this gives you the opportunity to go and comment on those things. Anybody can file comments. So if there's something that is particularly impactful to your state or your community, and you have you think you can shed some light, you go and you can either write a comment or you can just say, hey, I'm sending this platform as a way of informing the process, and I'm attaching it here. It's a very easy way of doing things. But yeah, I mean, as long as you can just raise your hand and say this stinks. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you want to raise something substantive, there's no particular format to making that substantive argument. You don't have to, it's not like filing a Supreme Court brief where it has to be in a very specific font with a very specific size, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And then Richard MacArthur asks, Is there a procedure for determining which rules and regulations may be outdated and unnecessary? I think we've touched a little bit on that, but
No, we haven't actually. So there isn't one, and that's something that is being called for, whether it's a sunsetting commission or the use of the Department of Government Efficiency. Right now, most of the agencies are doing what are called information collection requests, which are not rulemakings per se, but it's the opportunity for people to have their voice heard. So, for instance, yesterday was the end of the comment period from the Department of Transportation, looking for recommendations from the regulated public on rules that are outmoded and should be sunsetted. Otherwise, there are also bills out there, various pieces of legislation that would either automatically sunset, bring an end to a rule after a certain amount of time if it hasn't been re-upped. In fact, in Idaho, they've gone just the opposite way. Idaho is really one of the models for this. For those of you who are in Idaho, consider yourselves fortunate that all they have what's called zero-based regulatory budgeting, which is that every year essentially the rules have to be renewed by the legislature, otherwise they don't go into effect. And so
that seems like a great
yeah,
that seems like a good way to do it.
yeah.
I'm kind of blown away that there's no standing system to look at outdated or unnecessary regulations that are still in the books.
Right.
That's pretty surprising. Um, I have an interesting kind of a niche question here
Hold on, real
from
quick, Joel.
Dow.
I don't know why you would think that is surprising, given the fact that we understand the way that sort of power accretes over time. It's very difficult to. That's why what is being done right now is so remarkable in terms of the
Mhm.
comprehensive nature of this. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Niche question.
No, you're right. I mean, we know that government that based on our founders' view of psychology and going before them and the human spirit, government's going to keep growing. It's going to be what it wants to do. Oftentimes, I'm surprised though because so much of what we need in order to fix our government is already contained in our documents.
Right.
So much of it is things that are not being followed. So in this case, it's like, yeah, I know the agency's developed later, but the fact that we don't even have a standing process for that, am
Yeah.
I surprised? I guess not, but you have it, I would assume so. Dal Andrew asks, are regulations of the military, the Defense Department, I believe, subject to the public review process?
So that's really interesting. It depends on the circumstance. I think so I'm going to give a qualified no. For the most part, they're not. And I'll give you a really good example of this. For anybody who's a military dependent, a couple of years ago, the first of all, the individual services, Army, Air Force, Navy, et cetera, they consolidated their healthcare into something called the Defense Health Agency. Now it operates under the DoD. And they changed the way that the patients interact with the military medicine. They created something called MHS Genesis. And somebody made the decision that one of the ways to do an ID check on MHS Genesis was for people to have a soft credit check. You entered in some of your personal information and they would run a soft credit check on you. And I only knew about this because I had a daughter who contacted us as she was signing up for MHS Genesis and they wanted credit card information from her. And we're like, that sounds really fishy. You don't need a credit card for military medicine to get your services. This sounds like someone's trying to steal your information. Turns out, no. Somebody at the Defense Health Agency had made this decision, never put it out for public notice and comment. And I still to this day don't know who specifically made the decision. I mean, I sort of sent a general letter to folks over there, never heard anything about it. But so there are things when they sort of intersect with the public and the non-military community, but otherwise, for the most part, no, they don't need to do this. And there's a problem, obviously, with things like the soft credit check. In other areas, it really the way that we've sort of divided things up, the executive branch has enormous power to sort of make these decisions, and it's really left to the power of the purse at the congressional level to sort of change military behavior if they want to.
Interesting. Elaborate. Andrew K asks, elaborate statutes invite regulatory interpretation and the concomitant, don't know that word, but I think I can guess what it means, unintended consequences.
Right.
For example, low flow toilets led to significant problems for some sanitary districts whose water lines were designed for gravity feed with an assumed liquid to solid ratio in order for the lines not to become clogged. Would
Right.
not the push for single topic statutes help to ameliorate these ambiguities?
It would, but on the other hand, it also goes to the better need for regulatory cost assessment. I think Congress is going to do what Congress is going to do in terms of these rules, and it doesn't get to the statutes that are already on the books. But we do a very bad job in the government of assessing the cost and benefits of regulation, and an even worse job at dealing with the risks and unintended consequences of regulation. We don't do anything called comparative risk assessment. And what do I mean by this? I mean, we look at things in a very sort of single vector view. So, for instance, um, um, the Clean Air Act, has certain rules dealing with exposure to certain chemicals in a community. And I know I keep coming back to the environmental rules, but that tends to offer up lots of examples. So, for instance, if a chemical company wants to site a refining facility in a poor community, the one way of looking at risk and impact will say, okay, it's going to increase the cancer risk by X factor. Let's say it's going to double the risk of cancer in a population. Comparative risk assessment also will have you look at the unintended consequences of not citing this plant here, right? What happens if you don't give people the opportunity to have greater jobs and earn greater levels of income and buy better and more abundant food and get access to healthcare? And what happens? Can you, in fact, cut the cancer risk in half from where it is right now? And so we need to be doing much, much better at this. So we've made recommendations, especially in light of the previous administration fundamentally changing the rules by which we assess the costs and benefits of regulation to create all kinds of artificial benefits. That's really where the danger is. I appreciate the question, but we've got to get better at it at the executive branch level.
And I think we have time for a couple more. So Sally Jones asks, can you explain the Endangered Species Act and its impact on regulations? Has it been a good piece of legislation and the animals?
No.
Mhm.
It's simply put, the ESA is really not about protecting animals so much as it is about regulating land use. And next to the Clean Water Act is the single most impactful on property rights piece of legislation in American history. So essentially, it governs the kind of habitats that are out there. And unlike the Clean Water Act, where you've had a real narrowing of the scope of its regulatory impacts by the Supreme Court, very little of this has been done with regards to the ESA. The point is, those who push for greater levels of regulation in this regard, they want to have government owner control huge swatches, 30% of the federal landmass by 2030. And most of that is west, though they want to continue to push into the east. And so the idea is, whether it's timber production in the Pacific Northwest and the eviscerating of lumbering jobs, and then the commensurate impact on forest fires of this, to people being unable to repair fences down in Texas because of golden-cheeked warbler habitat, or the people in California not being able to get water because of the fairy shrimp. The ESA, and let me add to this, it creates perverse disincentives to species preservation. It creates what's called the shoot, shovel, and shut up syndrome, where you have more of an incentive to destroy whatever the habitat is.
Mm.
So it relatively few, I don't remember what the number is, but let's assume it's 1,500 species have been put on the endangered species list. And I think 100 of them have come off in the last 50 years. That's an insanely bad track record. Something new needs to happen.
Wow. So we're coming right down to the end. Do any of the other panelists have some closing thoughts or comments that they'd like to share?
Yeah, I'll go first. Yeah, well, what a fascinating topic to discuss. Thank you again, Andrew, for just
My
sharing
pleasure.
some of your wisdom on this and enlightening us. I also want to thank Angela for helping out today, too. Always great to have new panelists and hear from them. And then thank you, Jewel, also for moderating and did a great job.
Thank you. Angela, did you want to say anything? Thanks
Yeah,
for being on today.
thank you so much for having me. Sorry about my camera. It keeps glitching out a bit. Andrew, I just wanted to um ask you just kind of like in a tie-in question, because the Chevron deference is like really fascinating to me and what happened. Do you think in the coming years we will just really see positive change with that? What are your thoughts?
No, I mean, I think, listen, anytime government's powers are curtailed in this regard and puts the emphasis on making sure that that they have to do their math, right? They have to show their work. I think that's a very, very good thing. I think we're going to start to see that now. And then, of course, if the White House and Congress change hands, what happens down the road is vitally important. But again, journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, and Chevron is gone. I mean, and then that's not going to change anytime soon.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you to all of our listeners and the students who are on today listening. We really appreciate it. And you guys are future leaders of America. And
Yes.
please, all of you, join us next week. Have a good day, guys. Bye.
Thank you.